the world's largest and most magnificent empire, a power that had land and influence on every continent. How was it possible that it collapsed not because of a bloody war, but because of its own gold and silver from within? How could this even be possible? The answer was hidden in the very first days of the empire's birth. In other words, the moment the Spanish Empire was born, this silent collapse had already begun. Wherever you looked on the map of the old world, from one end to the other, there was always a land, a city, or a port that belonged to Spain. Wherever you went, wherever you looked, you could see their power or presence. Because they wanted to reach every beauty the world could offer them, they spread across such vast areas that people would say, "In this empire the sun never sets." But behind this saying was a much deeper and more solid power that went unnoticed. How did an empire where the sun never sets end up completely in darkness one day? When you first hear this, naturally wars come to mind. Did ruthless enemy armies defeat them? Or did a new superpower arise and destroy the Spanish Empire because it threatened its existence? Or was it a major external threat, diseases, plagues, that collapsed the country? None of these assumptions had any effect on this collapse. In other words, they did not fall when they were weak. They fell while they were at the peak of their power. So how was this possible? It happens by not managing finance. Let's examine how this happened throughout history from the very beginning of the story. The year is 1469. King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile got married. This marriage created one of the greatest unions history had shown until that time. Two completely separate kingdoms, two different cultures, and two different powers united under a single throne. Because marriages were not only between two people, it also meant the merging of powers. But in this marriage there was a small detail that no one really knew or cared about, something that looked insignificant but was actually important. The young couple, although powerful, borrowed money to hold their wedding. At that time, this detail might have seemed ordinary or strange, because everyone was happy. But when we look back today, we understand this. This debt was actually the silent cry of the far bigger financial problems that the newborn Spain would face in the future. The union of Ferdinand and Isabella initially created the image of a strong state around them. The tax system was reorganized for the people. The justice mechanism was improved to function more smoothly. Roads for quick and easy transportation were built, and the infrastructure was strengthened. These steps and reforms placed Spain on a solid foundation at the center of medieval Europe, because the support of a happy and powerful people reflected the strength of the country. Everything looked good from the outside, but on the unseen side, the debts taken to cover these expenses were silently growing into a very large problem. No matter how good the reforms were, the management of money was equally weak. And this weakness began to gnaw at the empire's future, like a small worm eating from the inside. Right at this moment, the flow of world history changed. Driven by adventure and the desire to explore the unknown and seize it, Spain crossed the Atlantic and reached the virgin lands of America. This was the opening of the greatest income-generating economic door in world history. With the colonies and commercial fleets they established, gold and silver arrived. Ships full of precious metals were discovered. The giant silver mountain in Potosi, the rich deposits in Mexico. For an empire, it was like the key to an endless treasure room. To explain what this meant with a simple example, so much silver was coming in that Spain, thanks to the system it established, brought in within a single century the amount of silver that Europe had extracted in 1,000 years. Finding this much wealth all at once created the same thought in everyone's mind: nothing can stop us now. But this is where the real breaking point occurred. Because Spain failed to consider a very simple question: is this much money really a good thing? The answer was certainly not what anyone expected. As silver and gold increased, prices also increased. Bread, cloth, oil, meat. All basic human needs became more expensive. But the wealthy didn't care. They already had gold and silver. However, as the elites became richer, the people became poorer, because the abundance of gold and silver reduced the value of the money the people used. To understand this, let's give a simple example. If bread costs 1 unit in a town, and the amount of money in that town suddenly increases tenfold, then bread also becomes several times more expensive. Pay attention. Everything stays the same, only the money itself, its purchasing power, depreciates. This was exactly the problem Spain was experiencing. Money increased, but production did not increase at the same rate, because gold and silver were arriving without being produced. They were simply coming from somewhere. But no one saw or wanted to see that the economy was weakening. There was no entrepreneurship, no production, no stable system. Simply put, the economy was not being managed well. Spain was eating, drinking, consuming, spending, but could not build an economic structure to replace what it spent. At the same time, the empire expanded so widely in territory that dealing with the chaos and managing the lands it possessed became a major burden by itself. Taxes were inconsistent, income was irregular. The wealth coming from the colonies was not strengthening the empire, it was weakening it. From the outside, the richness and prosperity made the empire look magnificent and gigantic, but inside, the foundations were silently cracking. Now a very important question arises. How did this empire where the sun never sets make such a small but deadly mistake from the very beginning? Spain grew. Gold and silver from America began to flow in quantities they never imagined, but no one noticed. Although this treasure filled the empire's treasury, it did not make the people wealthy. It was silently hollowing out the inside of the empire. So why did this happen? The silver from America. Throughout world history, even today, no country has ever seen such treasure in such a short time, and perhaps never will. But this treasure spread like a silent fire that fell inside Spain. Because if a country suddenly receives more money than expected, that country does not become richer. On the contrary, if money flows in and production stops, or if there is no production system or no regular economic ecosystem, this money ruins everything. Just like someone stranded in the desert who, after not eating or drinking for days, becomes extremely weak. If this person suddenly eats too much food and drinks too much water, the body cannot handle it, and death becomes inevitable. But if it is increased slowly, controlled carefully, that person recovers and strengthens rapidly. Spain experienced exactly the same thing. When gold and silver began flowing from America, prices inside Spain, which was already economically weak, suddenly rose. Today we call this inflation. Back then, no one knew this concept, but everyone felt its effects. Bread was expensive, cloth was expensive, oil was expensive. An ordinary person could not buy today what they could buy yesterday. So, why didn't Spain produce? If you were asked, is it easier to earn something through labor and hard work, or to win a gold lottery from somewhere? Of course, everyone says winning the lottery is easier, and they stop producing. Why bother with effort? But the problem here was this. In production, everyone wins if everyone produces. No one loses. But in a lottery, everyone enters and only one person wins. Everyone else loses. Spain had found the easy way. Basically, it had won the lottery, so it did not produce. What does a country that does not produce do? It buys from outside to meet its needs. Spain did exactly that. After all, it had gold and silver. Italian merchants, Dutch traders, German craftsmen, they all sold goods to Spain, and they sold them at whatever inflated prices they wanted. Spain didn't care. After all, it had gold. And Spain paid for these goods with its own silver, meaning the treasure coming from the colonies did not stay within the Spanish economy. This treasure should have increased the prosperity of the people inside Spain, but instead the money and gold flowed into the pockets of foreigners. Spain consumed, other countries produced. Spain spent, because they believed their gold sources would flow infinitely and endlessly. And as Spain weakened day by day, the other countries grew richer and richer. Meanwhile, England and the Netherlands were quietly but steadily growing on a strong financial ecosystem. They established banks, they established trade networks and expanded them. They constantly manufactured, produced, and created value. They understood the difference between wealth and money. But the Spanish did not understand this. This difference soon turned into an enormous gap. But Spain's mistakes did not end here. It did not stop there. In fact, they made such a massive strategic mistake that it developed into a deadly factor that would accelerate their collapse. So what was this deadly mistake? It was that the gold and silver they held in their hands were used not as a resource, but as a guarantee. This is a very dangerous strategy. Why? Spanish kings borrowed money to cover their expenses and luxuries by relying on treasures, gold, and silver that had not yet arrived. Wealth they did not yet have. This means the silver will arrive on this date. When it arrives, we'll pay. This is like a dangerous game of Russian roulette. If the bullet is not in the chamber, you survive. But if the bullet is in the chamber, the expected outcome is inevitable. It was extremely risky because if the treasure ship sank in a storm, or were captured by pirates, or were delayed, the Spanish Empire would not be able to pay its debts, and indeed they could not. And this is exactly why Spain, despite being the largest and wealthiest empire in the world, especially throughout the 1500s during the height of its power, went bankrupt repeatedly. 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607. Imagine an empire that owns half of all the mines in the world. But every 20-30 years it says, we ran out of money, we cannot pay our debt. Without bloody wars, without famine, without revolts, without plague, they collapsed financially by themselves. They went bankrupt. This situation especially turned Spain's internal order upside down, especially for the people. To pay the debts, taxes increased a lot. The people were crushed under the heavy burden. Farmers revolted. Some escaped to virgin and rich America. Some hid from tax collectors. Some wanted to become state officials to be exempt from taxes. In short, everyone tried to avoid staying under this burden and looked for a way to save themselves. As the state's debt burden grew, the number of state employees increased. For a job that 40 people could do, the state employed 1,000 people. In other words, the state began collapsing from the inside under the weight of its own debt and inability to manage its finances. No one wanted to pay taxes, but everyone wanted to lean on the state. This completely locked the system. While all this was happening, major problems also began to erupt outside, because when something starts rotting from the inside and begins to burst open, the external factors also begin to move, and external forces will touch the weakened country. The Dutch revolt, the new religious Protestant waves, Catholic Protestant conflicts, France's interventions in the country's affairs. Spain had to deal with inflation, debt, taxes, and revolts all at the same time. And at the root of all these problems, just as we said at the very beginning, there was one single truth. Yes, they found a lot of money, but they didn't know how to manage that money. Just like someone who wins the lottery and becomes rich at once, but becomes poorer than before because they cannot manage it. Spain went bankrupt because it could not manage money. The money they found became their curse. Spain's collapse did not start with wars or enemies. Spain's collapse began by being crushed under its own treasure. Silver was flowing, but the people were getting poorer. The country was growing in land, but the economy was weakening and continuing to collapse. But what was it that accelerated this collapse? How did Spain's already fragile economy become completely riddled with holes by wars? What made an empire was not only the economy, it was built on beliefs. Spain did not see itself just as an empire. It saw itself as the divine protector and servant of Catholicism. And this deep belief dragged it into war with almost all of Europe. Although these wars were fought for abstract beliefs, their cost required something concrete: money. Every war meant a new debt. The collapse working its way inside Spain was not limited to silver and inflation we mentioned earlier. The real major break began when the empire suddenly found itself in the middle of endless wars of beliefs and sects. These wars drained not just a part of the empire's treasure, but almost all of it. The reason was simple. Spain did not see itself only as a state. It had placed upon itself a duty to protect religion. This duty was to protect and spread Catholicism throughout Europe. This duty dragged Spain into wars that lasted for many years. First, conflicts with France on its own continent. Then the rise of the Muslim Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. After that, the Protestant movements in Germany. And all of these required Spain not only to send soldiers, but to constantly spend money. No matter why wars are fought or what ideas arise, wars have an inevitable cost. But the wars Spain entered did not even cover their cost. They were like a bottomless pit. No matter how much gold or silver it brought from the American continent, the amount of wars it entered and their costs were so great that no matter how much money it threw into that pit, it was never enough to fill it. That's why the silver coming from America, even before it reached the port, was going directly to war debts and creditors. Gold coins of the treasury, before ever circulating inside the country's economy, flowed to Italian shipbuilders, Dutch merchants, German mercenaries, and wealthy merchant banker families. One of the biggest examples of wars erupting was the Protestant revolt in the Netherlands. The Netherlands was one of Spain's richest regions. Its trade routes were strong and fluent, its cities crowded, and its production capacities high. But Spain's religious pressure and heavy taxes overflowed the patience of the Dutch people, who were already self-sufficient. The revolt broke out. And this revolt was so hard to suppress that it cost Spain dearly. And no matter how much gold and silver came afterward, the empire's financial situation never recovered again. As wars and revolts dragged on, Spain took on more debt. As it took on more debt, it used its future gold and silver as collateral. As it used future silver as collateral, the treasure ships became even more vital. In a sense, the empire was no longer fighting to finance the costs of wars and revolts. It was fighting because it had to mortgage the future treasures of the country in order to keep the wars going. If a ship sank, the state shook. If a storm broke out, the entire order was turned upside down. If there was a ruthless pirate attack, the empire experienced an economic heart attack. Even the smallest delays broke trust and made people uneasy. That's why the famous Spanish Armada expedition to England in 1588 was not just a military failure. This defeat hit the financial heart of Spain right in the center. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of ships, months of preparations. And instead of the victory that was expected to come, a massive failure, a defeat, and naturally a gigantic bill that came with it. At the same time, on top of these problems, the Catholic-Protestant conflicts in France, the growing tension in Germany, and the pressure of the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, all these fronts pulled Spain from every direction. It had to divide and spread its power and face these problems and expenses. Each front meant a new cost. Spain was an empire, yes, but no empire, even if it seems to have the economic power to sustain wars in 4 or 5 places at the same time, is actually in good shape if its finances are not well managed. And especially an empire whose economy was almost completely tied to the inflow of gold and silver was certainly not in that position. And right here, the snowball effect that grew over time began to show itself. The clearest signs of the break appeared. Silver was coming, but prices were rising uncontrollably. The money that came was going to wars, and production inside the country was approaching zero. As debt increased, future treasures were being mortgaged. The people were crushed by taxes, rebellions increased. Government employment had become the way to evade taxes, and despite all this, the wars were not stopping. Spain's period went exactly like this. Constant wars, constant borrowing. The empire's treasure began to be depleted, not only by wars, but also by plunder on the seas, because the debts it made were financed by the gold and silver coming over the seas. The silver arriving was going into other states' pockets before it even reached the country. Every lost treasure ship removed one more brick from Spain's resilience. The wars were not ending, the debts were growing. So if one of these ships full of treasure got lost, or was seized by pirates, could that have delivered the most critical blow that determined Spain's fate? Could it have been the needle that burst a balloon already about to explode? If even one ship sank, the whole system collapsed. Everyone knew this. And it wasn't only Spain that knew this. England and Dutch pirates knew it too. That's why treasure ships became not just a form of sea transportation, but critical targets. For a pirate, it meant loot. But for England and the Netherlands, it was an even bigger opportunity. Sinking a treasure ship equals shaking Spain economically. The most striking example happened in 1628. The Dutchman Piet Hein seized an entire treasure fleet. This was not just a simple pirate attack. This was an attack that created critical problems because Spain could not pay the debts it had to pay and the system collapsed. This attack was not just a financial loss. It was a very clear sign showing everyone that Spain would not be able to pay its debt. In other words, this was not just a single pirate attack. It stripped an empire financially naked. In the same period, the English pirate Francis Drake and others attacked Spain's ships, took the gold and silver and carried it to their own countries. England invested this money into shipyards, ships, trade companies, and banks to earn even more. The Netherlands used the same method and strengthened its trade networks and stock exchange with that same money. So every piece of silver Spain lost turned into a financial resource in the hands of its rivals, and into the new power that came from it. Think of an empire because of wars, rebellions, and pirate attacks. The financial order of a state, already not well managed, had now spun completely out of control. Meanwhile, thrones changed hands. Every new ruler tried to make reforms to escape this severe crisis, but the wounds taken were so deep that these attempts were only bandages on the wound. They were not strong enough to close the wound, because Spain had already been wounded too much. In the beginning, Spain wanted war. It wanted more land. It wanted a larger sphere of influence, and it took action to achieve this. But the problem was, it no longer had money. And if an empire runs out of money, its size on the map is useless. When Napoleon invaded France, the final blow came. When the center collapsed, the colonies, seeing what France experienced, said, "Why should we stay dependent on Spain?" and began declaring independence one by one. Spain no longer had the money, the army, or the power to suppress these revolts. And within a few years, it lost almost all of its vast lands in America. At the end of the century, the final blow came from the United States. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, all were lost. Thus, the empire people once saw and imagined as the empire on which the sun never sets came to a complete end. At the foundation of everything, there was only one thing. Money was not managed. The treasure was misinterpreted. Wealth was turned into temporary display instead of a permanent system. Spain found treasures, but those treasures did not create an economic structure that could keep the empire standing. Wars, pirates, debts, revolts, all led to the same result. Spain's collapse, its bankruptcy, was now inevitable. If you liked it or found it helpful, you can subscribe, like, or share. The choice is yours. See you in the next video.